The air inside the conference room was suffocating. The scent of polished wood and expensive cologne did nothing to mask the tension crackling between the people seated at the long mahogany table. Evelyn sat with her hands folded in her lap, her nails pressing into her palm, a habit she had long since mastered to keep her emotions in check. Across from her, Celeste lounged in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won. Their stepmother, Madame Lee, sat beside her, perfectly composed as always, her fingers lazily tapping against the table. At the head of the room, Mr. Graham, their family lawyer, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before glancing at the document in his hands. "We are gathered here today for the official reading of Mr. Jonathan Lee's last will and testament." His voice was calm, professional, but Evelyn could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Celeste smirked, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the table. "Let's just skip to the part where my name is on everything, shall we?" Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. There was no point in arguing, at least not yet. Mr. Graham continued without reacting to Celeste's arrogance. "According to Mr. Lee's final wishes, his controlling shares of Lee Enterprises will be passed down to—" He turned the page. A pause. A second too long. Celeste's smirk widened in anticipation. Madame Lee sat up straighter. Evelyn held her breath. Evelyn Lee. The silence that followed was deafening. Celeste's smile froze. Madame Lee's fingers stopped their rhythmic tapping. Evelyn blinked, stunned, but quickly schooled her features into something unreadable. Then, what? Celeste shot up from her chair, her voice sharp with disbelief. "That's impossible." Mr. Graham barely spared her a glance, as he continued. "Mr. Lee's controlling shares of Lee Enterprises will be transferred immediately to Miss Evelyn Lee. She will hold the final decision in all company matters moving forward." Celeste's chair scraped against the marble floor as she stepped forward, glaring at the lawyer. "This has to be a mistake. My father wouldn't. He wouldn't leave the company to her." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Why wouldn't he?" Celeste turned to her, eyes burning with rage. "Because you don't deserve it." Evelyn met her gaze, unflinching. "Neither do you." Madame Lee finally intervened, her voice smooth and calculated. "Mr. Graham, is there any clause for contesting this decision?" Mr. Graham sighed, as if he had expected this. Mr. Lee was aware that his decision might be controversial. He left clear instructions that any attempt to contest the will would result in the forfeiture of all remaining assets to charity. Celeste looked like she might explode. Madame Lee, however, only narrowed her eyes, her expression unreadable. Evelyn swallowed, her mind still racing. Her father had left everything to her? The company, the power, the responsibility? She wasn't sure whether this was a gift or a curse. But as Celeste turned to her, eyes blazing with hatred, Evelyn realized one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Evelyn barely had a moment to process the weight of her father's decision before Celeste slammed her hands onto the table. The sound echoed through the conference room, sharp and furious. "This is a joke," Celeste hissed, her voice low with barely contained rage. "There's no way my father would leave everything to you." Evelyn held her gaze, forcing herself to stay composed. "And yet, he did." Celeste let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. "You think this makes you special? You think you can run Lee Enterprises?" She scoffed, stepping closer, her voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing but a shadow in this family. A charity case my father took pity on." Evelyn felt the words like a blade, but she refused to let them cut her. "If that's true, then what does that make you?" she asked calmly. "Because, last I checked, I'm the one sitting in your seat now." Celeste's hands curled into fists. Madame Lee finally spoke, her voice smooth, controlled, dangerous. "Mr. Graham," she said, her gaze never leaving Evelyn, "there must be some way to overturn this." The lawyer, seemingly unfazed by the hostility in the room, adjusted his glasses. Mr. Lee was very clear in his wishes. Any attempt to contest his will would result in all remaining assets being liquidated and donated to charity. Celeste clenched her jaw, but Madame Lee's lips merely curled into a small, unreadable smile. I see. Evelyn's grip on her chair tightened. That expression, she had seen it before. It meant trouble. Celeste turned back to Evelyn, stepping dangerously close. You think you've won? She whispered, just loud enough for only Evelyn to hear. This isn't over. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure everyone knows it. Evelyn met her glare, without flinching. Then you'd better hurry, she said, voice steady, because starting tomorrow, I'll be sitting in Father's office. Celeste's eyes burned with fury, but before she could say another word, Madame Lee placed a hand on her arm. That's enough, Celeste, she said, her tone deceptively gentle. Let's not cause a scene. Evelyn knew what that meant. Madame Lee wasn't backing down. She was plotting. As the meeting adjourned, the weight of her father's decision settled fully onto Evelyn's shoulders. She had won the title of CEO, but this was only the beginning. She was stepping into a war. And she wasn't going to lose. Evelyn sat frozen in her chair, the weight of her father's decision pressing down on her like an iron chain. The silence in the conference room was thick with disbelief, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had spent years perfecting this mask of composure, of restraint. But deep inside, her heart pounded against her ribs. The lawyer's words still echoed in her mind. Mr. Lee's controlling shares of Lee Enterprises will be transferred immediately to Miss Evelyn Lee. Her, the forgotten stepdaughter. The one who had never been groomed to take over the company. Evelyn clenched her hands together beneath the table, her nails pressing into her palms as she absorbed the shock. Across from her, Celeste looked like she was on the verge of an explosion. Her perfectly styled waves barely moved, but her hands were trembling with rage. Celeste had always been their father's favorite. Or at least, she believed she was. She had spent years positioning herself as the heir to the empire, living in the spotlight while Evelyn remained in the shadows. And now, in one swift stroke, their father had taken it all away from her. Celeste shot up from her seat, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is a joke, she snapped, her voice sharp with disbelief. There's no way my father would leave the company to her. Madame Lee, ever the picture of composure, placed a delicate hand on Celeste's wrist, as if silently commanding her to control herself. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, cold and calculating, were locked on Evelyn. Mr. Graham, Madame Lee said, her voice silk and steel, are you certain there are no loopholes? This decision seems highly questionable. The lawyer, an older man with years of experience in handling high-profile clients, didn't even blink. Mr. Lee was very thorough in ensuring his wishes were carried out, he replied. The will is airtight. Any attempt to contest it will result in the complete liquidation of all remaining assets, with the funds going to charity. Celeste inhaled sharply. That's not possible. It is. Mr. Graham flipped through the papers in front of him. Your father made sure that his decision could not be overturned. The transfer of shares is already in progress. Miss Evelyn Lee is now the largest stakeholder in Lee Enterprises. Celeste turned back to Evelyn, her expression twisted with fury. You don't deserve this. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm despite the storm brewing around her. You're right. I never expected this. She tilted her head slightly, meeting Celeste's glare with quiet defiance. But I didn't steal anything. Our father made his choice. Celeste let out a bitter laugh. You think this is over? She leaned in closer, voice low and venomous. You don't belong here, Evelyn. You never did. And I'll make sure everyone sees that. Evelyn held her gaze, without flinching. Then you'd better move fast, she murmured. Because starting tomorrow, I'll be sitting in Father's office. Celeste's lips curled, but before she could lash out, Madame Lee's voice cut through the tension. That's enough, Celeste. She stood gracefully, adjusting the pearl bracelet on her wrist. Unlike her daughter, she wasn't acting out in anger. No, she was thinking. Plotting. We will handle this properly. Celeste looked like she wanted to argue, but the warning in her mother's tone made her hesitate. Madame Lee turned back to Evelyn with an unreadable smile. Enjoy this moment while you can, dear. The board won't be as kind as my husband was." With that, she swept out of the room, Celeste following behind her, still fuming. Evelyn exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to slump in her chair. The fight hadn't even begun, and yet she already felt like she had walked through fire. The lawyer gave her a small nod of approval. "Your father believed in you, Miss Lee. Now, you'll have to prove him right." Evelyn swallowed and straightened her posture. "I intend to." The next morning, Lee Enterprises headquarters. The towering glass skyscraper of Lee Enterprises loomed above her as Evelyn stepped out of the car. The morning sun reflected off its sleek windows, making it appear almost too pristine, like a castle built of ice, cold and untouchable. She had walked into this building hundreds of times before, but never like this. Never as the CEO. As she entered the lobby, heads turned. Employees whispered. Their surprise was obvious, their skepticism even more so. No one had expected her to be the one sitting at the top. She squared her shoulders and moved forward, ignoring the murmurs. At the reception desk, a woman, probably new, since Evelyn didn't recognize her, stared wide-eyed before stammering. Good morning, Miss Lee." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Good morning. Please inform the executive floor that I'll be arriving shortly." The receptionist fumbled for the phone, her hands shaking slightly. Evelyn walked away before she could hear the rest of the call. She had bigger things to deal with. As she reached the private elevator, a familiar voice called out behind her. Well, well. Look at you. Walking in like you own the place." Evelyn turned to find Richard Kang leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. Tall, effortlessly confident, and always dressed in perfectly tailored suits, Richard was one of her father's top advisors, and someone Evelyn had always been wary of. "I do own the place now," she said coolly. Richard smirked, pushing off the wall. "That's what I'm interested in. Do you actually know what you're doing? Or are you just playing pretend until the board kicks you out?" Evelyn arched a brow. "You tell me. Are you here to help me, or to watch me fail?" Richard chuckled, stepping into the elevator with her. "I haven't decided yet. But I do love a good power struggle." The elevator doors slid shut, enclosing them in silence. Evelyn exhaled slowly, gripping the folder in her hands. This wasn't just a new chapter in her life. It was a battlefield. And she was ready to fight. The executive boardroom was a battlefield, and Evelyn knew the moment she stepped inside that she was already outnumbered. The long, oval-shaped table was filled with men in tailored suits, each one a veteran in the corporate world. Some eyed her with curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. A few, like Richard Kang, who sat lazily in his chair, watched with amused detachment, clearly waiting to see how the drama would unfold. Evelyn walked to the head of the table, her heels clicking against the marble floor, and placed her folder down. She took a steady breath before speaking. "Good morning," she said smoothly, scanning the room. "As of today, I will be assuming my role as CEO of Lee Enterprises. I understand that my father's decision may have come as a surprise to some of you. To say the least," a deep voice interrupted. Evelyn turned her gaze toward Nathaniel Cho, one of the senior board members and a longtime ally of Madam Lee. His salt and pepper hair and sharp features gave him a formidable presence, but Evelyn had expected his opposition from the moment she entered this room. "You're young, inexperienced, and let's be honest, Miss Lee, you were never part of this company's succession plan," Nathaniel continued, folding his hands together. "So forgive me if I ask the obvious question, why should we trust you to lead?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Evelyn let them speak, let the tension build, before she finally responded. She met Nathaniel's gaze directly. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Cho. But let me be clear. I am not here to play pretend. My father entrusted me with this company, and I do not intend to disappoint him." Nathaniel scoffed. "Words are cheap, Miss Lee. What exactly do you bring to the table?" Evelyn took a measured pause before she picked up the folder in front of her and slid it down the table. "This," she said simply. One of the executives reached for it, flipping through the pages before his brows lifted in surprise. "This is a full operational audit," Evelyn said. "Over the past 3 years, The company's profitability has remained steady, but growth has stagnated. Our competitors are advancing faster, adapting better. I've identified key areas where we're falling behind and outlined a strategy to address them. Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. You've been analyzing the companies? For years, Evelyn admitted. I may not have been in the boardroom, but I paid attention. I know where this company thrives, and I know where it's weak. And trust me, there are more weaknesses than you'd like to admit. The murmurs shifted from doubt to intrigue. Richard, who had been silent until now, smirked slightly, clearly entertained by the shift in power dynamics. Nathaniel, however, wasn't so easily impressed. He leaned forward, his expression unreadable. And what makes you think you can fix it? Evelyn held his gaze. Because I'm not here to run this company the way it's always been run. I'm here to make it better. A long silence followed. Then, to her surprise, a voice spoke from the end of the table. I say we give her a chance. All heads turned toward James Wu, another senior board member. He was known for being pragmatic, rarely taking sides unless there was something to gain. She clearly came prepared, James continued, flipping through her report. And whether we like it or not, Mr. Lee put her in charge. We'd be fools to ignore that. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, but didn't argue. Evelyn took the moment of hesitation to strike. I will not ask for blind trust, she said, standing taller. I will prove that I can lead this company. But I will not allow anyone to undermine me while I do it. She glanced toward Nathaniel and then at the other board members. If any of you have doubts, say them now. Silence. Evelyn let it stretch, making sure her words settled in before she finally nodded. This meeting is adjourned. The executives began gathering their things, some murmuring amongst themselves, others casting her speculative glances. Richard lingered as the room emptied. Well, he mused, stepping closer. That was entertaining. Evelyn exhaled, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the table. You expected me to fail. Richard smirked.
No.
I expected a bloodbath. He tilted his head. You handled yourself better than I thought you would. Evelyn gave him a sharp look. I don't need your approval. He chuckled. No, but you might need allies. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. Are you offering? Richard's smirk widened as he walked toward the door. That depends. Can you survive the storm that's coming?
And with that he left.
Evelyn stood alone in the empty boardroom, staring at the city skyline beyond the glass windows. She had won this round, but she knew that the real battle hadn't even started yet. Meanwhile, Madame Lee's estate. Celeste paced furiously across the marble floor, her heels clicking sharply with every step. I can't believe this, she snapped. That little nobody just waltzed in and took everything that was supposed to be mine. Madame Lee, seated gracefully on the velvet sofa, stirred her tea calmly. Throwing tantrums won't change the fact that Evelyn is now the CEO. Celeste whirled around. Then what do we do? She demanded. Because I am not sitting back and letting her take over our company. Madame Lee sipped her tea before placing the cup down with precision. Patience, darling. Evelyn may have won the first battle, but the war is far from over. Celeste clenched her fists. What are you planning? A slow, knowing smile curved Madame Lee's lips. There are ways to ruin a person without ever laying a hand on them. She reached for her phone, dialing a number with practiced ease. It's time, she said smoothly. Let's see how well our dear Evelyn handles betrayal. Celeste's lips curled into a smirk. Let the games begin. Evelyn was still settling into her father's office when the first blow landed. The scent of rich leather and polished wood filled the air, but the room itself felt foreign, like she was trespassing in a space that had never been meant for her. She had barely taken her seat behind the massive mahogany desk when her assistant, Grace, rushed in, face pale. Miss Lee, we have a situation, she said, placing a tablet in front of Evelyn. Evelyn frowned and glanced at the screen. A news article was plastered across it, the headline bold and damning. New CEO of Lee Enterprises hiding a dark secret? Evelyn Lee's past resurfaces in scandalous reveal. Her blood ran cold. She quickly scrolled through the article, her stomach tightening with every word. It was a character attack, a carefully crafted piece designed to discredit her. The article painted her as an unqualified heiress who had only returned to the company out of greed, implying that she had spent years living recklessly abroad before conveniently inheriting control. There were even fabricated claims that she had been involved in a financial scandal during her time overseas.
Complete lies.
But the damage had already begun. Grace shifted uncomfortably. The media is running with the story, and investors are starting to panic, Evelyn finished grimly. Of course. This was an orchestrated attack, and she had a very good idea of who was behind it. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. Schedule a press meeting for this afternoon. I want full access to the legal team. We're shutting this down before it spreads any further. Grace hesitated. There's more. Evelyn clenched her jaw. What now? Grace handed her another file. The board is calling for an emergency meeting. They want answers. Of course they do. Evelyn exhaled sharply.
Fine.
Set it up. She had expected Madame Lee and Celeste to retaliate, but not this quickly. It seemed they weren't wasting any time. 1 hour later, the boardroom. The tension in the room was thick as Evelyn walked in. She met the board members' stares head-on, her posture rigid, refusing to let them see the uncertainty clawing at her chest. Nathaniel Cho was the first to speak. Miss Lee, would you care to explain this? He slid a printed copy of the article across the table. Evelyn picked it up, glanced at it once, and then placed it down with deliberate ease. A poorly executed hit piece meant to discredit me. Nathaniel scoffed. It's circulating everywhere. Our stock has already dropped 2% since the article went live. This is more than just bad press. James Wu, the only one who had somewhat supported her before, sighed. Evelyn, if we don't get ahead of this, we could lose investor confidence. Evelyn leaned forward. And reacting out of fear will only make us look weak. She turned her gaze back to Nathaniel. You think I should step down? Nathaniel's silence was answer enough. She smirked. Too bad. I'm not going anywhere. Nathaniel's lips pressed into a thin line. If you truly care about this company, you consider what's best for it. Oh, I am, Evelyn said smoothly. Which is why I've already arranged a public statement to address these accusations. Our legal team is working to shut down the sources spreading misinformation. She folded her hands together. This company has faced scandals before. The key is controlling the narrative, which I intend to do. Some of the board members exchanged glances, clearly reconsidering. James Wu nodded slowly. If you can contain the situation, we'll back you. Evelyn smiled. Then let's get to work. Nathaniel, however, wasn't done. You think you can handle this alone? She raised a brow. Who said I was alone? The door suddenly opened, and Richard Kang strolled in. I believe this is my cue, he said lazily. Nathaniel frowned. What is he doing here? Richard smirked, tossing a folder onto the table. Damage control. He turned to Evelyn. I figured you'd need an expert on cleaning up corporate messes. And lucky for you, I happen to thrive in chaos. Evelyn studied him carefully. She knew Richard wasn't the type to offer help for free. There was always an angle. But right now, she needed all the firepower she could get.
Fine, she said.
Let's fix this mess. Meanwhile, Madame Lee's estate. Celeste threw her phone onto the table, her face twisted with frustration. She's already countering the story. Madame Lee, however, remained calm. She picked up the phone and dialed a number. Then it's time for Plan B. Celeste perked up. Plan B's? Madame Lee's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. Let's see how Evelyn handles betrayal from within. She turned to her assistant. Leak the financial records we discussed. The assistant hesitated. That could be risky. If she proves they're fake, she won't have the time, Madame Lee said smoothly. By the time she fights this fire, we'll already be setting another. Celeste's smirk returned. Let's see if Evelyn can survive this. The press conference. Evelyn stood at the podium, cameras flashing wildly as reporters shouted over one another. The air was thick with anticipation, everyone eager to see how the fallen heiress would defend herself. She adjusted the microphone, her expression unreadable. I will keep this brief, she began, her voice steady. The rumors about me are false, fabricated to discredit my leadership, and those responsible for spreading them will be held accountable. A reporter called out, but what about the financial scandal? Did you? No, I did not. Evelyn cut him off sharply. And I will not entertain baseless accusations. Another voice rose from the crowd. Investors are already pulling out. How do you plan to fix the damage? Evelyn met the reporter's gaze, without flinching. By proving my worth. Not with words, but with results. She turned toward the cameras, her next words directed at those watching from behind their screens. To my employees, this company will not fall. To our investors, have patience, because Lee Enterprises is about to enter its strongest era yet. And to those who seek to bring me down, she let a smirk touch her lips. I suggest you brace yourselves. Because I'm not going anywhere. The room went silent. Then Richard Kang, seated in the front row, started clapping. One by one, others followed. Evelyn had turned the tide. But the battle wasn't over yet. The final betrayal. Madame Lee's plan had been set in motion. By the time Evelyn returned to her office, Grace was already waiting with a grim expression. We have a problem, she said, handing Evelyn a fresh report. Evelyn scanned the document, her stomach tightening. A new financial leak. Someone had fed false records to the media, painting Evelyn as an embezzler. Her grip on the paper tightened. Celeste. She stormed out of her office, heading straight for the family estate. The confrontation. Celeste was waiting for her. Finally, Celeste mused, sipping wine. I was wondering when you'd come crawling back. Evelyn slammed the falsified documents onto the table. This was your doing. Celeste smirked. Prove it. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice dangerously calm. I don't need to. You've already lost. Celeste's confidence faltered.
What?
Evelyn pulled out her phone and hit play. Celeste's own voice filled the room. She won't have the time. By the time she fights this fire, we'll already be setting another. Madame Lee's voice followed. Let's see if Evelyn can survive this. Celeste's face went pale.
How?
Evelyn smirked. Did you really think I wouldn't be watching you? That I wouldn't be 10 steps ahead? Celeste's hands clenched. This changes nothing. Evelyn tilted her head. Oh, but it does. She gestured toward the door. Guards stepped inside. Celeste Lee, Evelyn announced, you are hereby removed from Lee Enterprises. Effective immediately. Celeste screamed in outrage as the guards grabbed her arms. You can't do this to me, she shrieked. Evelyn leaned in. Watch me. As Celeste was dragged away, Madame Lee simply sighed. You're more like your father than I thought. Evelyn met her gaze. That's why I won. For the first time, Madame Lee smiled just slightly. Let's see how long you can keep your throne, dear. And then she walked away, her game lost. But Evelyn? Evelyn had won. Months later, Lee Enterprises had fully stabilized under Evelyn's leadership. Richard Kang smirked as he watched her from across the boardroom. You did it. Evelyn smirked back. Of course I did. And as she looked out at the city skyline, she knew. She was no longer just the heiress. She was the queen. And no one would take that away from her. Thanks for watching. For more stories, please subscribe Eververse Novel.